Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm flying solo, and I'm flying solo with a great subject because I get to play with ancient history. So I'm never depressed when it comes down to flying solo on something like this. But my guest today is Brett Devereaux, whose research specializes in the Roman Republic, which we haven't done in a long time, actually, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries military. And we're actually going to be talking about some military history today, and specifically the Roman army. Hello, Brett.
Hello. Great to be here.
I'm excited, as I am when it comes down to ancient history, because we get to do something that I did at university and then I can kind of get past on a basic conversation with. So we've been actually chatting probably for the past 10 minutes before we actually record about random things like Vespasian, because he's cool.
He's funny.
He's so funny. I love him. And so that I will tell you to this day, that quote of when he's dying is the most funniest thing ever. Like, who lays there and says, "Now I'm becoming a god"? I mean, we all know because he eventually, does become a form of a deity. I guess that's the way you'd say it. So, yeah, Vespasian. I think we need to do a podcast on Vespasian because he's a badass and he's funny and he's hilarious. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the Republic, which I'm really rusty on, so bear with me. I've pulled out my Roman Republic book by Michael Crawford. So, Michael Crawford, if you do not help me today, I'll be very upset. If you're not listening, then don't worry about it. So, anyway, let's start with the first question. So, we're talking about the 2nd century in Rome. When we usually think of Rome, a lot of people don't think about the Republic. They see off the TV, they see emperors, and they see what Rome was like as an empire, ruled under an emperor, however you want to say it, rather than the Republic, rather than being governed by the people, in theory, than one man. So let's talk about Rome in this century, so the 2nd century. It's not really that impressive, is it, at this time period? Why isn't it so impressive?
Right. So the Rome of the 3rd and 2nd centuries is not yet the dominant Mediterranean power. It's a major player, but it's not the biggest player yet. Rome's great conquests are going to start happening through the 3rd and 2nd century. And so if we're looking at the 3rd century, again, 200s BC, Rome is one of really 5 major great powers in the Mediterranean. Rome, by this point, has managed to conquer what the Romans consider Italy, which is peninsular Italy south of the Po, not including Sicily, not including northern Italy. That's their base. The next of the sort of great powers is Carthage, operating out of North Africa. In what today would be Tunisia. Carthage controls much of the coast of North Africa, about a third of Sicily, and some of the coast of Spain. Carthage is a great naval power. And then in the east, you have the fragments of Alexander the Great's empire, right? Alexander the Great kicks it in 323, dies young. Famously, according to our sources, his last words when his generals asked him to whom he willed the empire was toi kratistoi, to the strongest. Y'all fight each other for it, which is a very Alexander the Great thing to do. His generals over the next decade assassinate every living member of Alexander the Great's family and then begin killing each other over his empire. That eventually coalesces into the three largest fragments. In Egypt, one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy I, makes himself pharaoh. That creates the Ptolemaic kingdom. The Ptolemies are the wealthiest power in the Mediterranean. By far, in terms of state revenue, they are rich, loaded. Egypt is a very wealthy area. In what today would be Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and parts of Turkey. One of Alexander's bodyguards, Seleucus, Seleucus the First Nicator, he seizes control over that large area, extending into what is today Iran. The largest single unit, his descendants are the Seleucids. And then the final sort of smallest and poorest fragment is the actual traditional Macedonian kingdom where Alexander was from, north of Greece. And here, the descendants of Antigonus, another one of Alexander's generals, set up their kingdom there. So we call them the Antigonids. In terms of like putting these powers in kind of relative order to give a sense of like the population and size, the Romans are probably in control of something like 3 to 4 million people in this period. Carthage is about the same size in terms of control, maybe a little bigger. The Antagonids are a little smaller, probably around 3 million people. Egypt is about the same in population, but Egyptian revenues are probably 6 times Roman revenues because
Holy
Egypt
shit.
is so wealthy.
Wow.
Yeah, so a scholar, Michael Taylor, has done these estimates, and he figures annual Roman revenues in this period are about, he's doing currency equivalents, but equivalent to 12 million Attic drachma per year, whereas Egypt is pulling in 75 million.
Out. That is a big difference.
It's a big difference. It's a big difference. And then population-wise, the Seleucid Empire is enormous, somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. So it's 5 or 6 times larger in population than any other. Seleucid revenues are probably 50, 60 million Attic drachma per year. So they're runner-up in revenues and the clear standout in population. So Rome is a major player in this environment, but it's not the biggest power by any means. And you wouldn't necessarily tag the Romans as being like, these are the guys that are gonna come out ahead. That's roughly the situation in, say, 220. By really the 150s, the Romans have, well, by 146, the Romans have destroyed Carthage. They have destroyed the Antigonid kingdom. They have crippled the Seleucids, and they have turned the Ptolemaic Empire into a vassal state. They have cleared the board. And so we go in this period from a sort of a system of 5 equal powers to Rome has dominated all of them really quite quickly, and really quite shockingly so. And this makes it a really interesting period to study. Rome is at war almost constantly in the 3rd and 2nd century. Rome is only at peace for 8 of these years.
How long does it actually take for them to conquer all of these nation states?
So Rome doesn't always immediately exercise political control over the areas that they defeat. So for instance, the Romans deliver the sort of catastrophic defeat to the Seleucids in 190 at the Battle of Magnesia. They then make a humiliating peace treaty, and the Seleucid kingdom sort of stutters onward all the way into the 60s BC, when it will finally be abolished by fiat by the Roman general Pompey Magnus. He just sort of gets rid of it because why not? The Ptolemaic kingdom is massively weakened. They're smart enough never to fight the Romans, but when the Romans are all that's left, they're in trouble. Obviously, they kick around all the way. The last Ptolemaic pharaoh is Cleopatra. The Romans fight their first war with Carthage in 264 over Sicily, their second war with Carthage in 218 over basically the whole of the Western Mediterranean. And then a third final conflict with a very much weakened Carthage that ends in 146 when the Romans destroy the city.
So we're kind of looking at, for all of these nations, because obviously there's different time periods that these nations are being fought over. So we're talking about, let's say, what, 150 odd years, something like that?
Yeah.
That's not bad for conquering literally, was it 5 other nations?
Yeah, and a host of smaller peoples. I mean, basically the whole of the Mediterranean basin.
Wow. Okay. So who is the person that sparks all of this, actually? I'm going completely, by the way, off topic from questions because I've really gotten interested.
Yeah, that's fair. So there isn't, like, Rome isn't operating under one singular leader in this period. It's a republic. So it's a sort of power sharing arrangement among the elite. The Romans have elections to decide their chief magistrates. The people who run from those elections are drawn from a relatively small number of important families. But then the common people, the common citizenry gets to vote to decide, which rich guys get to hold office and which don't. And instead, it's the collective direction of the Senate, which is a body of 300 former office holders, which is really directing Roman policy in this period. Now, there are a lot of structural reasons why the Romans are aggressive and expansionist in this period. Part of it has to do with the political system. If you want to make a political career in Rome, you want military glory. The key office here is the consulship. This is the highest office in the Roman Republic. There are always 2 consuls at any given time, and they command Rome's main armies. You have other lesser commanders that command subsidiary armies, but these command the main Roman armies. They're elected. The thing is, you run for the consulship, you get a single year's term. So if you want to rack up military glory, if you want to be a great conqueror, you have to do it right away. And so no one who's elected consul is going to be happy with congratulations, you won the election, but we're at peace this year. That's not going to fly. And likewise, nobody's going to decide, well, no one's going to want to say I should go on the defensive this year and let the guy elected next year win the war. No. In fact, this becomes a major problem for the Romans in their second war with Carthage. This is the war with Hannibal. Because Hannibal is a sort of once in a generation military talent. He rules a Carthaginian army, which is mostly made up of mercenaries he's recruited from Spain and Gaul, southern France. He rolls this army into Italy, and he is just smashing Roman armies left, right, and center. He wins 3 major victories in a row. The Romans are really on the back foot. And you have this sort of political contest that is happening between Roman leaders in the Senate, particularly Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator, the delayer, who are what we should do is we should stop fighting pitched battles with Hannibal that we lose, and we should bottle him up and try and win the war where Hannibal isn't, which is the strategy Rome eventually adopts. But they're constantly running into this.
Eventually, you say eventually adopts. So it takes them how long to adopt this policy?
So they confront Hannibal in 218 at the Trebia and lose. They then confront him again in 217 at Lake Trasimene and lose an entire army.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And then in the winter from 217 to 216, they make Fabius dictator, and he holds back. But then as we get into 216, the Romans get so antsy with this defensive strategy that the new consuls come in, Terentius Varro, and they're like, we're going to let this guy go for it. And so the Romans raise an extra big army. Usually each consul has their own army separately. They're like, we're going to put these 2 together, and then we're going to double them again. So instead of a normal 20,000 man field army, it's going to be an 80,000 man field army. And then we're going to show Hannibal what for. And the result in 216 is the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal lures this army in, encircles it, and destroys it.
Oh, dear God. Okay. I thought you were going to say, this is it. This was that moment. This 80,000 men are going to finally conquer Hannibal. No. Why are you doing this to me?
No. The Romans lose about 60,000 of those men.
Oh, Jesus. That's more than, that's nearly 3/4 of the army.
Well, that's 3/4 of the army that was raised. Now, the Roman we'll talk about this, Rome has a conscription-based military, so they draft more guys.
Right, we'll come back to that. Right. I've gone completely off topic. Let me get us back on topic. Because I'm getting all excited about these things.
But anyway. if you want this really mind-bending, right? Rome's war with Hannibal and Carthage, the Second Punic War, it begins in 218, and it will only end in 201. So the Romans being drafted for the final armies of this war were not born when it started.
I'm a bit dumbfounded. I don't know if the silence that I should have given.
And it isn't. And this isn't. I want to be clear. This isn't like the 100 Years' War where it's on again, off again, whatever. No. This is 18 years of high intensity conflict. Hannibal is in Italy pillaging the countryside the whole time.
You need to come back. We need to discuss this 18-year war because
It's not even the longest Roman war with Carthage. Rome's first war with Carthage starts in 264 and ends in 241.
Jesus. Right. Okay. No, 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 no. Okay. Let's stick to what we've got because I want you to come back and we need to do these battles because
Do the Punic Wars. Yeah, okay.
I need to know why do they keep fucking up, basically? Why are they losing? This makes no sense. They're supposed to be the strong military power and they just
They win the war.
Yeah, after how many years?
A few.
Exactly. So I
As
need
many as it takes.
to... I'm just, oh my God. Yeah, I didn't do military history. So in university, I kind of did more of the social side, occasionally a bit of politics. But so I'm kind of interested in knowing a little bit more about the wars. So okay, right. So we have touched on this a little bit, managing to sweep away their opponents eventually after 18 years. Anyway,
It's a very slow sweep.
it's very exactly. Oh my God. Okay, so this very slow sweeping. You're going to say it's not down to using more men because Chris has just thrown this question out. Is it down to using more men? It's first of all, I can tell you it's not because that's what you're going to tell me, right?
Yeah, it's not just more men, though I do want to stress that the Romans do have more men. That's part of how they withstand all of these defeats. So it is not a question of course, raw population. There are not more Romans. What is different first is that the Romans can draw militarily on a much larger slice of their resource base. That includes people. It also includes economic resources as well. In terms of people, and to give a sense of this, the Romans do somewhat unusually account in 225 BC, conveniently just a few years before this gigantic war, to figure out how many men they have liable for conscription. And we'll get into this, but it's a two-tier system. You have Roman citizens, and then there are also all of these other Italian communities that are not Roman citizens, but that Rome has subjugated that also have to serve in Rome's armies. And Rome euphemistically calls these guys the allies, the socii. They're not allies, they're subjects, but Rome is being polite. And they do account in 225, and they figure that between Rome and their allies, they have around 700,000 men of military age who are liable for conscription. And to be liable for conscription, you had to have enough wealth and property to afford your own weapons and armor. That wasn't a super high bar, but you did need to meet it because the Roman state doesn't like issue you a sword. You need to buy a sword.
Hold on.
When you're drafted.
Wait a minute. If we put this into modern terms, it's like, hi, sorry, you have to go buy your own guns. We're not going to provide you with anything.
We're not correct.
We're not going to provide you with any equipment, any Kevlar vests, or your binoculars, or your £1 million worth of equipment. You have to go buy it yourself.
Yeah. The law requires you to go buy these things if you're drafted. And then when you're drafted, you have to go get them. We don't care how you get them, but you have to go get them.
I love that. We don't care how you go and get them. So basically, you can just go and steal them. They just don't care.
I mean, you could, though. I mean, theft is not legal, but beg, borrow, buy, whatever. The Roman state doesn't care how you get them. It just that you have to. And for Roman citizens, they're responsible for equipping themselves. For the allies, it is the allied community's responsibility. So, let's say the Polignians. It is the responsibility of the Polignians with their own governing structures, their own local government, to figure out how they're going to handle that problem. Whether the community buys the equipment or the individuals do or whatever. The Romans don't care. So you guys figure it out. So that limits who's liable for conscription. But they have about 700,000 men liable for conscription in Italy, which is just an enormous number. And it allows them to sort of take these hits and keep coming. What's wild is, so we talked about these defeats. Between 218 and 216, the Romans probably lose somewhere between 80 and 100,000 men fighting Hannibal. That does not cause them to lower their expectations. Instead, Rome responds by raising one army to be in southern Italy to bottle Hannibal up. They're going to send another army to northern Italy to fight the Gallic communities in what the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul, which is like around Venice, that have supported Hannibal. A third army is going to be operating in southern Italy because some of Rome's allies have switched over to Hannibal's side, and the Romans are going to crush them. They're going to send 2 more armies into Spain to destroy the Carthaginian, to capture Carthage's empire there. And they send another army into Sicily, which the Romans by this point control, because the Syracusans in Sicily are getting ideas, and the Romans would like to disabuse them of that notion. And then they're going to send the navy into the Adriatic because the Antigonid Macedonian kingdom thinks that now is a cute time to sort of muscle in on Rome's interests there. In 212, Rome has 185,000 men under arms.
That's a lot of people.
Split between all of these armies. And for relative comparison, Hannibal crossed over the Alps with 20,000 men. And the maximum deployment for the Seleucid Empire, which, as you recall, population-wise is the biggest, the largest their army ever gets is 80,000 men.
So in theory, the Romans do have more. This actually can lead me to my next question quite nicely, because if they're not winning, let me rephrase that. If they're losing to Hannibal with 80 to 1,000, was 80 to 1,000?
80,000, yeah.
Okay, if that's what they're losing to Hannibal, with Hannibal only having 20,000.
Yeah, he's up to 40 by the time of Cannae because he's recruited more guys from Cisalpine Gaul. So he's
still got less.
He's still got less. Oh, yeah.
He's still got less. So he's winning with less men.
He is.
Even though I'm assuming the Romans have better equipment?
They do.
Okay, and they're still losing.
Yeah. So Hannibal is a clever tactician. The way he wins at Cannae is he takes advantage of the way that the Roman legions fight. You know, other generals have their clever flanking maneuvers and what have you. As far as the Romans are concerned, the quickest way to an enemy's rear is through their front. So, like, Roman armies are very much, you just kind of grind your way forward. And so what Hannibal does is he weakens the center of his army, he strengthens his flanks, and he lets the Roman army sort of push itself into the bag and then encircles it and is able to destroy it that way.
Oh, that's smart.
And so, oh yeah, Hannibal is, like I said, I mean, by and large, the Romans defeat Carthaginian armies more often than not. Hannibal is this once-in-a-generation military talent that can just keep fooling Roman generals. Though his luck does eventually run out, and he loses against Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama in 202. It takes them a while. But yeah.
He's still doing pretty well with his 20 to 40 compared to 80 to 100.
Yeah. No, this is fair. What the problem, of course, is that Hannibal can't be everywhere. So Hannibal ends up in southern Italy. What the Romans do is they assign an army after Cannae, after the disasters, like, let's not do that again, to basically shadow Hannibal. And the way ancient logistics work, Hannibal can't gather supplies. That limits where he can move. So Hannibal advances, the Romans will back off. They'll stay close enough that he can't supply himself locally, and so he has to retreat back into the areas he has better control over. They then use that to bottle him up in southern Italy, and then proceed to disassemble the Carthaginian Empire everywhere else. So they wipe out Hannibal's other allies in Italy. These had been Rome's allies that had defected. They crush Hannibal's supporting Gallic tribes in Cisalpine Gaul. They disassemble the Carthaginian Empire in Spain. It takes years. They're conquering their way down the coast of Spain over the course of years. And then eventually the Romans send an army against Carthage itself in North Africa, at which point Hannibal is finally recalled to command the defense. And it's that process that takes years, and the Romans are just grinding the Carthaginians down. And the Romans win most of those battles. I don't want to give the impression that the Romans lose most of the battles. The Romans win most of the battles against people not named Hannibal. And I will note, the Romans win most of the battles against people named Hannibal. Hannibal's a really common Carthaginian name. But they lose the battles against that Hannibal over there.
Hannibal.
The Hannibal Barca, we would say. But the Romans are sort of grinding this down. That said, you're right. They do actually, the Romans have the better equipment. It's better enough that after his initial victories, Hannibal, we're told, uses all of the captured Roman equipment to re-equip his elite troops, the African troops that he's actually brought from North Africa, the actual Carthaginians in army. He equips them completely in Roman style, to the point where our sources are like, you could have mistaken them for a Roman legion, because he's got them completely in Roman kit because it's better. So that kind of gets us to equipment. So the Romans throughout this whole period show an incredible willingness to invest in more expensive equipment, especially for their infantry. Generally in ancient armies, how you are in society is how you fight. So cavalrymen are people who can afford horses. They're rich. Okay. But the infantry are usually the lower classes. This is true for the Romans as well. So Roman cavalrymen are drawn from the very wealthy. Roman infantrymen are mostly what we would call smallholding farmers, right? They have a little family farm. It's enough to feed their family, probably not a lot more. Nevertheless, these guys equip themselves, as we mentioned. So they might be willing to spend a little bit more on their own armor that is protecting their life. And we can look at these sort of costs a few different ways. Now, here's where the sources are troublesome. No sort of prices for Roman equipment survive to us. The sources don't record how much a helmet costs. But one way we can look at this is okay, how much metal is a soldier wearing on the battlefield? Because you have to forge all of this stuff by hand. Metal is really expensive in the ancient world. It's much more expensive than leather or wood or cloth. And so the average say soldier in a Macedonian army, so Seleucid army or the Antigonid army or whatever, for their heavy infantry corps, their elite troops, carries about 5 kilograms of metal on him into battle between his weapons and his armor on average. Your average Gallic warrior is less, about 2 to 3 kilograms. These guys make up actually a pretty big portion of Hannibal's army. They're the cheap mercenaries he's using to sort of flesh out his force. By the contrast, the Romans are about 8 kilograms per soldier. So they're carrying a lot more expensive metal. And a lot of this has to do with the Romans, and Polybius tells us this. The Romans think like all of the heavy infantry should have some kind of metal body armor, which is pretty expensive. Wealthier Roman infantrymen have picked up what is, in this period, a brand new technology, chainmail, or we might say more correctly, mail. This is actually an armor that was invented by the Gauls, but in Gaul, only the ultra, ultra rich can afford it. The Romans invest in this for relatively common soldiers. So this is, again, an armor of interlinked metal chains in a 4-in-1 pattern. They alternate riveted and solid rings that lock into each other.
Sorry to interrupt you on this. It's similar to what we would relate to as medieval chainmail.
Almost identical.
Okay.
The armor does not change.
Okay.
Basically identical. And for a full shirt, you need something like 40,000 rings. So it's a lot of iron, and it's time consuming to put together. It takes on the order of 2,000 hours to assemble a mail shirt.
Hold on, to assemble just one?
Just one.
Okay, wow, that's incredible. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of time and effort. And the Romans take this armor that really in Gaul was only for like the rich fancy pants on his horse, and they're like, yeah, we're going to have the mainstay of our infantry wear this stuff. It's really effective because it's a kind of metal. You're basically making a metal fabric, so it's very flexible. You can move in it very freely, but it is iron, so it's very hard to get a weapon through it. And the Romans use this a lot. The Romans also are willing to invest in weapons. The standard armament of a Roman infantryman, he has his sword, the famous gladius, in this case, the early form that we call the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword. The Romans are open that they adopted this from Spain. They got to Spain, they're like, these guys have some great swords. We're going to make our swords like that. And then the other thing that the Roman heavy infantryman carries is 2 heavy javelins. They're called, this is the pilum, plural is pila. And these two are expensive weapons. They're designed to be armor and shield penetrating. And so whereas most javelins will have just a wooden haft and then a small iron tip on the top, what the Romans have is a heavier wooden haft, and then the iron tip is this long 30, 40, 50 centimeter long thin iron shank with a tip on the end of that. And the idea is that if your enemy like sees the javelin coming and he puts his shield up, the tip punches through the shield, and the thin shank behind it is thinner than the hole the tip is made. And so the mass of the wooden haft is going to keep pushing this javelin forward, and it's long enough that it will cross the space between the guy's shield and his body to strike him behind his shield. So it's a nasty little javelin, or
Does
nasty
it
big
actually
javelin.
work?
Yes. Yes, modern reenactors have reconstructed this and tested it, and it does function as described.
Wow. I would be actually terrified if I was on the battlefield to see one of those coming at me.
Yeah, well, and the way the Romans do it, right, is, Roman armies like to attack. They don't like to defend. So the Romans are going to come up at you. The Roman army engages in 3 consecutive lines. So you're going to have the first line coming at you. And what the Romans are going to do is they're going to advance until they're about 20 yards or so, or 20 meters, your choice, about the same distance, away from you. And then that whole formation that's coming at you, it's about 6 men deep. They're all going to throw the first of their pila at you. So you're going to get a shower of these heavy javelins coming in. And then they're going to charge. And on the run in the approach, they're going to throw the second of these heavy javelins at you just before they come in at point blank range with their swords, and then the very large Roman shield, the scutum, which is this sort of body shield that covers the Roman from knee to shoulder. You see these all the time, big rectangular shield. So yeah, it's going to be a rough day for you. You're going to get 2 javelins in the face, and then the Roman is going to come in with this Spanish sword and try and gut. It's very effective. The Romans do tend to win their battles. Again, Hannibal kind of uses this against the Romans. He knows they'll be aggressive, and so he uses it to lure them into traps. But for generals that aren't as skilled as Hannibal, this is rough stuff. But it's an expensive way to fight. You need a lot of iron for those javelins, for these swords, for this armor. Roman helmets are also pretty heavy and stout, unusually so. And so it's we'd say a material intensive way of war. You need a lot of stuff. On top of that, the Romans are also in the habit, Roman armies on the march build a fortified encampment every night when they stop. So at the end of the day, the Romans stop, they start building a fort, and you don't get to sleep until the fort's built. And in the morning, you disassemble the fort, and you bring it with you, and you build it again. And this way, the army always has a safe place to retreat to, and it's hard to ambush. But that means the Romans have to bring all sorts of construction equipment with them. And so our sources are repeatedly amazed. They're like, these Romans on the march, they don't just have their shields and their armor and their weapons. They've got picks and shovels and baskets and chains, and they're carrying the entrenching stakes that they'll make the wall of the fort out of with them as they move. And so, of course, all of this is resource intensive. It's expensive. And again, the way the Romans do this is that they expect these soldiers to show up to the muster when the army forms up with all their stuff. And the famous Roman tool is the delabra, the Roman pickaxe. This is like the multi-purpose Roman entrenching tool they use for everything. And so the Romans are carrying those too. So it's a very expensive way of war.
So this brings us nicely, because you've just mentioned about resources. You've just mentioned how they're having to literally carry their whole camp with them.
Yes.
With such an expensive army, with such expensive equipment, and such a large army, we're talking about thousands of men, how are they resupplying? How are they supporting their armies?
Yeah, so the Romans are, as I think is coming out here, uncommonly both willing and able to pull resources into military activity. And a lot of this has to do with the structure of Roman control in Italy. So most empires, the way you set up, and this is how the Carthaginian Empire is set up, this is how the three Hellenistic successors of Alexander's empires are set up. The way it works is you have an imperial core that's relatively small that has conquered these areas, and it imposes tribute, it imposes taxes on these guys. And so you conquer people and you make them pay you money. And then you use that money to fund military activity. But that imposes a lot of inefficiencies. People don't like to pay taxes, so you have to garrison these places. You need bureaucrats to assess the taxes. Those guys need to be paid. They're expensive. They have to be literate. And so you have inefficiencies in this money flow as you have this sort of system where you use an army to impose taxes on people, and then you use the taxes to pay the army, which imposes taxes, which pays the army. What Carlos Nareña calls a military tributary complex. Use the military to generate the tribute and the tribute to pay the military. The Romans don't do this in Italy. Instead, when the Romans expand in Italy initially and they begin conquering their neighbors, the Romans follow what I jokingly refer with my students as the Goku model of imperialism. We beat you, therefore we are friends. It's a Dragon Ball reference. So some listeners will get this, some listeners won't. It's fine. What Rome does when it defeats you in Italy, the Romans won't do this outside of Italy, but in Italy, is they impose a treaty on you. And the treaty says, you're now our allies. Here's the deal. At the moment of conquest, we're going to steal your stuff, take your land. It's going to be rough. But after that, the deal is going to be this. Whenever Rome goes to war, you have to go to war. The footnote here, Rome is at war every year. So Rome is always at war. So you're always at war. You have to supply soldiers for our armies. We don't care how you do it, just that you do it. And in exchange, we protect you. You get a share of the loot when we win. And this is going to be our relationship. And we're not going to impose taxes on you because what you're really paying us in is soldiers and in their equipment and their supplies. And we're not going to interfere with your local government. We don't care how you govern yourselves so long as when we muster armies, your guys show up. And the result then is that all of those expensive layers of bureaucracy are unnecessary. Roman soldiers equip themselves, so you don't need to bother with that. When Rome wants to raise resources for its armies, they do have taxation to pay for things like the food supplies for the armies. But Roman soldiers, they fight for the honor and glory of Rome. They're conscripted and you barely pay them. It's an expectation of citizenship that you serve. And so Roman soldiers are paid basically just enough to afford to eat. And in an acute twist, the Roman state does issue rations to soldiers because you need to handle that centrally. But when you get paid as a Roman soldier, you're billed for the cost of your meals. So it's like, here is your pathetic pay minus the cost of your food. So you get almost nothing because you're serving for honor and the duty of citizenship. And remember, the soldiers are voters. They're serving for a republic they view as their own. And so you can ask them to do a lot for basically nothing. Because Rome is at war almost constantly, the average Roman citizen would have served about 7 to 8 years in the army, citizen male. That wouldn't have been necessarily in one stretch. The Romans prefer to recruit young men, so you become eligible for recruitment at 17. It's a conscription system, so you don't have a choice. And you're probably going to get drafted for 7 or 8 years across your late teens and early 20s. The burden of military service is so heavy, it deforms Roman marriage practices. Roman women generally marry 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Roman men generally marry 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, even into their early 30s. And the reason is that nobody wants to marry a guy that's going to go out and die in the army. So Roman men only marry after their military service is done. And the sort of genius of the Roman system is that they have that system for their own citizens. But then through their alliances in Italy, they're basically franchising that system in every other community in Italy. And so Roman citizens only make up about 2/5 of every Roman army. The other 3/5 are these allies. And it lets them deploy absolutely spectacular amounts of resources. at the same time, because everyone serves and everyone buys their own equipment, the male population in the countryside consists entirely of battle-hardened veterans who already own their own arms and armor. So if you lose an army, you just call up the next bunch of guys who will arrive with their own equipment ready to go. And you can keep doing that, cycling through as necessary. And so the Romans can maintain just staggering military commitments. Often, the Romans are often fighting on 2, 3, 4, 5 fronts at the same time with these different armies. The Roman political system makes that easier too. The Senate, as I mentioned, the directing body for all of this, is a body of 300 former magistrates, former elected officials. So when you serve in a high Roman office, when you're done in office, you go into the Senate. But that means the Senate is a body of former generals and administrators who can be pulled at any time to command one of these armies. So the Romans we need to raise another army. Okay, we need someone to command it. The consuls are busy. Well, who was praetor last year? Pull that guy, give him the job. He has experience. What about last year's consuls? They can do the job. Or the consuls of the year before that, they can do it. And so the Romans don't run out of generals either. And they're able to maintain just this staggering level of military performance with armies that are not only more numerous, but better equipped and have more combat experience, because Rome is always at war. And so the result is that they are able to sweep the table. We've been talking a lot about Carthage because of the 5 major Mediterranean powers, Carthage is the only one that puts up a decent fight. The Romans managed to crumple the rest in short order after they've defeated Carthage. Carthage is, I will note, also the only power that manages to come close to matching Rome's numbers. Maximum Carthaginian military deployments are about 150,000. So the Carthaginians come close. Those are mostly mercenaries. The Carthaginians are hiring anyone in the Western Mediterranean they can get their hands on, mostly from Spain and Gaul. So that would be Spain and France. Those are enthusiastic soldiers, but they're not nearly as well equipped as the Romans. And commanded by people other than Hannibal Barca, they tend to come off poorly. But Carthage gets closer than anybody else. And we will absolutely have to come back sometime and just go through the Punic Wars. They are insane.
Yes, and this is the one thing that I really desperately want to do now, because we've been talking so much on this. I'm now officially hooked, so thanks for
that. Well, good. Hopefully your listeners are hooked too. I mean, Lord knows
yes.
we need it. Classics as a field, the study of the ancient world is in real trouble in both the US and in the UK. Departments are shrinking, departments are closing. So we need all the public support we can get.
Exactly, which is why we're here and got you on to come and do some talking for us. So
yeah.
Brett, this has been amazing. Like you said, you need to come back and do the Punic Wars. I think this has been so much. There's so much more we can talk. I've 1,000,001 more questions, and we could quite easily probably go on for the next hour. And I've been trying to hold it all in rather than be overly excited about everything and anything. Question: how do our listeners get hold of you?
Yeah, so I am on. I'm still going to call it Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Brett Devereaux. I am also on Blue Sky at Brett Devereaux. Easy to find. I also have a weekly ancient and military history blog, a collection of unmitigated pedantry. That is acoup.blog, acoup.blog.
Amazing. So go grab the blog, listen to the podcast. We'll get Brett back to talk about the Punic Wars. I think we've had such a great time, and you've been such a pleasure to interview. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.